Good morning, everyone. Hi. We're going to start in just a couple of minutes. Before we begin, our question and answer process is a little different today. Everyone should have gotten the opportunity to pick up a card when you came in. If not, we have some more. When you have a question, please write down your name, affiliation, and your question so that we can. I've got a little echo going on. Oh. Okay. That was strange. Quick test, quick test.
Noon. Thank you, all of those who are in person and online, for joining us here at the Center for American Progress. My name is Patrick Gaspard. I'm the president and CEO of CAP, and I'm really anxious and excited to get into what I believe is a necessary and what will be an insightful conversation. Almost 8 months have passed since Hamas's brutal terrorist attack on innocent Israelis, a heinous act that's further entrenched the cycle of violence and suffering in the region. Since that attack, the Netanyahu government has launched an offensive in Gaza that has killed over 36,000 Palestinians, most of whom are women and children. Famine has now taken hold in Gaza, and Palestinians are experiencing a full-blown humanitarian crisis. The collective punishment has compelled us to confront a critical question about human rights doctrines embedded in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. President Biden's recent announcement that he would withhold weapons from Israel should they launch a major invasion of Rafah has been a welcome step towards using the influence of the United States to end the current fighting. And on Friday, President Biden announced that Israel has offered a new ceasefire proposal that would involve the withdrawal of all IDF troops from Gaza, an infusion of humanitarian aid, and the release of all hostages over a series of phases. President Biden's announcement ratchets up the pressure on all parties to work towards an end to the violence, an end that is many months overdue. Joining me today is a leader who has been engaged over quite some time on the long history and the devastation of this conflict, and he knows it better than just about anyone else in Washington, D.C. His work has been instrumental in shaping conversations around U.S. involvement in the region, not just in the past 6 months, but as I said, over the course of many years. He has emphasized the importance of aligning our actions with American values and, of course, with international law. I'm privileged to welcome Senator Chris Van Hollen. Senator Van Hollen is a leader whose dedication to peace, security, and justice in the region is unparalleled. I'll tell you that I first had the opportunity to engage with Senator Van Hollen in about 2007, Senator, when you were leading a political effort. And what struck me at the time is that it was rare for me to encounter folks in Washington who took up raw electoral politics in a way that was not maximalist, that was not zero-sum, but that always foregrounded the ability to come together afterwards in order to lift up a constructive, productive American enterprise. I think those instincts have, of course, served him well first in the Congress and then in the U.S. Senate, and as a leading voice in foreign policy, particularly as it relates to this conflict. Senator Hollen played a pivotal role in crafting National Security Memorandum 20, released in February. This memorandum created crucial oversight for U.S. weapons transfers to security partners and to make sure that those transfers are both aligned with our nation's values and comply with international law. His efforts show that American foreign policy has the potential to be a force for good, able to promote peace and security while upholding the greatest and highest standards. With that, I'd love to invite the senator up for a fireside chat. Yeah. Am I on? Awesome. Senator, I said quite a few things about you just now, but I'll tell you that I've been mostly really quite moved by your warnings about what it means to take up the kind of strategic overreach that comes from shared pain and shared trauma. You gave the experience of the U.S.'s own engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan following 9/11. And you sounded that note in the hopes that we would not find ourselves in this spiraling humanitarian crisis that we are indeed in now. You've said that centering human rights in U.S. foreign policy requires us to move from sentiment to substance and from rhetoric to reality. I wonder, given that we now have the National Security Memorandum 20, if you believe that that is moving us from sentiment to substance and from rhetoric to reality in a way that does the thing that President Biden made a commitment to during the 2020 effort, when he said that we would foreground human rights practice in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, first, Patrick, let me just say it's great to be with you. It's great to be with everyone at CAP. And thank you for putting this together. I have been a long believer that U.S. foreign policy needs to be rooted in fundamental principles and values. And that obviously is a view that's shared by President Biden, who emphasized that repeatedly when he was running for president and as president. And if we're going to do that successfully, we need to make sure that we follow those principles as closely as we can in an imperfect world. I mean, this is a messy world. We recognize that, and we're far from perfect. We've made a lot of mistakes, in my view, including the Iraq War, and we should learn from those mistakes. And in a letter that I authored with actually a majority of the Senate Democratic Caucus to President Biden back in November, we said, you know, we need to work with our partner and friend Israel to try to make sure that some of the mistakes that we've made in some of our engagements are avoided as best as possible. And if we're going to be true to those principles, we have to apply them not just to foes and adversaries, but to friends and allies. Otherwise, our adversaries will say to the world, the United States is just using this as a political tool in a cynical way. They talk about human rights, they talk about the rule of law, they talk about democracy, they talk about self-determination, but they only apply it as a cudgel, you know, against China or against whatever adversary we may be dealing with. And China, Russia, Putin, they use what is perceived as our hypocrisy as a weapon against us. And so we need to do our best to apply our values to friend and foe alike. That was the origin of the amendment that I offered along with 18 of my colleagues last fall that says that U.S. military assistance, which by definition should be going to friends and partners, at least it should not be going to adversaries, but that when we provide military assistance, it should be aligned with our values. We have other policies. We have the Leahy laws. We have the CAT policy under this administration. But for the first time, what we wanted to require was the recipient countries to agree that our military assistance would be used in a manner consistent with international law. And very importantly, that those countries would comply with international standards for the delivery of humanitarian aid in conflict zones where our weapons were being used. It applied, you know, to every party that was then under what was then the National Security Supplemental. In NSM 20, we worked with the administration to make that a global policy. So it's an important tool. And to really get to your point, it's an important tool if it's used. And I do think that the administration has used it to make incremental progress in some areas. So obviously with respect to the war in Gaza right now, they've used that to try to push the Netanyahu government. But in my view, it could be used much more effectively. And, you know, we can talk about the report that was issued, which in my view fell short in many, many places. So important tool. Tools are only as good as the political will to apply them effectively.
Senator, I appreciate all the work that's gone into the amendment process, the release of the memorandum, and appreciate your thoughtful critique. But the word incremental really stands out just now. And I know that you've been at the Rafah crossing. It's hard to reconcile the notion of incrementalism in the face of what's been described by you as atrocities, war crimes, forced famine, and even as U.S. weapons like 2,000-pound bombs continue to flow into the area of conflict. You have been rightly a staunch defender of Israel. But in this moment where you yourself have borne witness to these challenges, how do we reconcile this notion of incremental progress? And are there things that could and should be done now in the implementation of NSM 20? And are there further adjustments that we need to make to the doctrine itself for its future application?
Sure, there are things that should be done. And look, as you said in your opening comments here, this latest chapter in the conflict in the Middle East began, of course, with the horrific Hamas attacks on Israel of October 7th, murdering 1,200 people, taking hostages. And so what I've said from the beginning is Israel, of course, has the right to self-defense. In fact, they have a duty to defend themselves. But you can have a just war, but it still has to be fought justly. That is clearly laid out in the Geneva Conventions. It's clearly laid out in U.S. Policy. And so I have been very disappointed, especially when it comes to the restrictions on the delivery of humanitarian assistance, that the United States has not done more to use all the tools at our disposal. So, for example, we have a law on the books under the Foreign Assistance Act, 620I. It's very clear. It says that if any country is restricting the delivery of humanitarian assistance, that the United States, the President of the United States, will block military assistance to that country unless the President waives it. There's a procedure in there for the President to waive this sanction. In my view, that standard, that threshold, was triggered by the conduct of the Netanyahu government restricting aid in Gaza a long, long time ago. That U.S. provision, legal provision, should have been triggered. And the straightforward way for the administration to do it would either be to enforce the law and back then say, we're going to restrict offensive military assistance. It applies to offensive military assistance, not defensive systems like Iron Dome or other air defense. Or if you don't want to do it, do what President Clinton actually did way back in the case of where Turkey was restricting humanitarian assistance into Armenia, sign a waiver. But the law was triggered. Don't pretend the law was not triggered. Now NSM 20 has an even broader provision that says that recipient countries must facilitate and not arbitrarily restrict or impede, directly or indirectly, U.S. Delivery of humanitarian assistance. That, and we can go into the reasons, but that clearly has been triggered in my view. I just spoke this morning to Stacey Gilbert, who's recently left the State Department, 20-year veteran, working on human rights issues, who left because it was so obvious to everybody working on humanitarian assistance that that standard had been violated. And yet, in the NSM 20 report, that was fudged. So the bottom line, Patrick, is I think the United States needs to make more effective use of our influence, whether it's on offensive arms transfers, whether it's in the UN Security Council. We need to use more of our influence to affect the Netanyahu government's policy. I've said, and I strongly believe, that a partnership requires a two-way street. It cannot be a one-way blank check. We apply limitations, restrictions, conditions, whatever you want to call it, on military assistance around the world. It's actually the norm, not the exception. And there's no reason we shouldn't use all the tools to try to make sure that the President of the United States' policies and concerns are respected by the Netanyahu government.
You said so much just then, Senator, but your raising of Stacey Gilbert makes me want to kind of pull back and bring a little bit more historic context to the conversation that we're having this morning and some of the history that I want to surface here. You'll forgive me, Senator, some of your personal history. I see Matt Duss is here. Matt is the one who flagged for me Stacey Gilbert's principled resignation. And when Matt flagged that for me, it immediately conjured up something that I had read a long time ago that was written by your father, Ambassador Van Hollen, who was privileged to serve this country in East Asia. You were born overseas because your father was a lifetime Foreign Service officer who became ambassador. Your father wrote a memo called Revisiting the Tilt Policy, which was about the healthy dissent that he had when he was serving in the Nixon administration, pushing back against a gentleman named Henry Kissinger, who organized a set of policies on East Pakistan, which was then undergoing a human rights crisis that Henry Kissinger thought activists were being incredibly naive about because he thought that the China relationship was much more important. And your father wrote a famous memo, but internally was engaged in dissent. You are what anyone would describe a team player for your side, but you're asking some really powerful questions, not just now, but over the course of time about U.S. policy in this region. I wonder how much of your public dissent on this issue is informed by your own father's experience as a diplomat in the heat of the Cold War.
Well, thank you for raising that. Patrick mentioned as we were coming in, he might raise this story about my dad. Yeah, Henry Kissinger is famously, quote, at least famously in our family, is saying, you know, something along like, "What's wrong with that man, Van Hollen?" And he wasn't referring to me; he was referring to my dad, obviously.
Badge of honor.
So my dad's from Baltimore originally. He went into the Navy, and then he went into the Career Foreign Service. He met my mom, who was the daughter of an English teacher. She became fluent in Russian. She really took to languages. She went to work at the forerunner of the CIA. They got married, and then in those days, the State Department wasn't nearly as good at accommodating two career spouses, which is one of the reasons I sponsored the Foreign Service Families Act a couple of years ago. But they were a great partnership. I did, you know, learn from my dad and my mom the pride in representing the United States overseas. But one of the things we pride ourselves on is trying to be, you know, consistent with our values. And there is this mechanism for dissenting when you disagree with the policies of the government. And it's absolutely true. My father took a lot of issue with the way Henry Kissinger was conducting our policy when it came to Bangladesh at the time, the war in 1973, opening to China. My father at the time was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near East and South Asia. That used to be a position back then. They've changed a little bit. So I am a believer that we have an obligation to stand up for what are our American values. And look, obviously, I work with the president and the Biden administration on a whole range of issues on domestic policy, and I give them strong marks on when it comes to policy against Putin and helping Ukraine and our China policy. But yes, we have some differences here. And in this case, my view is that the administration needed to be more forward-leaning in using all the tools that we have available to try to implement the president's own stated goals. I will say it looks terrible when you have, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu repeatedly rebuff the president of the United States without any serious consequence. That also sends a bad signal in terms of the credibility of U.S. foreign policy. So this is an area where I have encouraged the president and his team to do more. I believe in, I think, you know, individuals who are working at the State Department, you know, in this area are making some tough decisions. I totally support those who are staying. I also support those who decide, like Stacey Gilbert, like others who have decided they could make a bigger difference by leaving, to do that. So, but my father did encounter some similar things internally. It was actually probably harder for him than me because he was, again, within the State Department. I'm in a separate branch of the government, fortunately.
Well, but you know, your father's a hero to many of us who served in the Foreign Service because of the scaffolding he put up around the notion of constructive dissent. So thank you for revisiting some of that history. I want to bring you back to the proximate challenge, but give you an opportunity in responding to this next question to talk a little bit about the evolution of your own thinking on this protracted conflict. You were at the Rafah crossing some months ago. In a recent interview that you had with the New Yorker, you talked about the blockages to humanitarian aid, medical supplies that can't make their way in, food stuff that just can't arrive to where it's needed, and you described it in terms that I can only consider to be war crimes. Can you give us a sense of what you witnessed at the Rafah crossing, and then when you were at the Rafah crossing and subsequent to that, how has that made you reconsider your own policy work over these many years on the region? How's your thinking evolved as a result of what you've seen, experienced in this moment?
So a little later on, we should get to this issue about what's next. Is there any light at the end of this very dark tunnel? And I think we're all familiar with the proposal that the president laid out on Friday, which he described as having been presented by Israeli government. It's important that Hamas immediately accept those parameters. It's also important that Prime Minister Netanyahu hold firm, even as he has these very extreme, super right ultra-nationalists like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir threatening to leave the government. I went to Rafah in January along with Jeff Merkley, Senator Merkley and I went. And I went because, like all of you, we were sort of seeing the stories of extreme deprivation, of humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and wanted to try to find out exactly what was happening. And in going to the Rafah crossing, and we were on the Egyptian side, we tried actually to get into Gaza. We were not able to do that. But we saw all the parts of the system that are creating this humanitarian crisis. One was just the huge backlog of trucks at the time, where they were really not being allowed to cross in a timely manner, whether through Rafah or Kerem Shalom. Kerem Shalom had just opened a few months before. That took a very long time, of course, to get it open. But the other piece of it was the arbitrary nature of what goods were turned back. We visited a warehouse just full of rejected items, right? Water purifiers, water testing equipment to see if the water was potable, maternity kits, tents, supposedly because of the tent poles. Just a whole warehouse full of stuff that had been rejected, and including, stuff provided by UNICEF. These are solar-powered units to declare desalination units. No plausible, dual use as weapons. And when one item on a truck was rejected, the entire truck was required to turn around. And at that time, we're talking about 2, 3, maybe even 4 weeks back to the line. And then the other thing we did was we talked to humanitarian aid organizations, NGOs, that have operated worldwide for decades. And they said they'd never seen a worse man-made humanitarian catastrophe than in Gaza. And the other big piece of it was this deconfliction issue, right? We know about the World Central Kitchen killings. A lot less attention was given to the over 200 Palestinians who were killed delivering aid in the preceding months. Just the other day, 2 Red Crescent medics were killed trying to provide help. So this deconfliction issue, which is just sort of a bureaucratic term for trying to make sure people can deliver aid from one place to another safely, is critical. You can say there are more trucks crossing the Kerem Shalom crossing today. That's true. But it doesn't do you much good to get across if you can't then deliver those goods to people in desperate need who are starving. So yes, this whole system, in my view, when you look at it in its totality, it was a violation of international humanitarian law. The deliberate withholding of assistance is a war crime where the intent was there. And I specifically mentioned two people, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Smotrich, at the time I made that statement, was literally holding up lots of flour when people were starving in northern Gaza. He was holding it up at the port of Ashdod for weeks, deliberately. And Ben-Gvir has been very clear that he doesn't want national police preventing, the protesters who are actually blocking aid from getting out. He doesn't want to prioritize police to clear the blockades to let humanitarian assistance in. So look, in my view, this was why the NSM-20 report.
Protesters who were exhorted by right-wing government leaders to go and
exactly. We should get to that whole issue in a moment. But that's right. And so this is why the NSM-20 report, it really failed on this point. This is why, people like Josh Paul and others have been, and Stacey have been so vocal. And this is the views expressed, according to their reports, by the overwhelming majority of people in the government working on these issues. And so we need to be doing more. We need to be doing more at this moment. I was pleased to see the president say we're not going to ship, 2,000-pound bombs that could be used in Rafah, but his red line on Rafah was broader than that. It was, if you don't respect this red line, we're going to withhold offensive weapons across the board. He did that because he knew that if you saw a big, invasion in Rafah, you'd see the humanitarian crisis get worse. It is. You'd see more civilian casualties. We've seen them. And you would recognize that it's harder to get the hostages home. And all those things are true. So again, that was an important step, but it needs to be one of many steps.
Senator, can I push you to make the distinction between offensive weapons and defensive weapons? Before you said that Israel has the right to defend itself, actually has a duty to defend itself. But we know that over the course of the last 10 years alone, $39 billion in military aid has gone from the U.S. To Israel. I think that you have said that the U.S. taxpayer has a right to have some transparency around that aid and has a right to see that aid attached to our standards and our principles. Yeah. Can you make the distinction for our audience of what you mean between offensive weapons and defensive weapons in the context of Israel having been attacked with missiles that are still entering into their territory? Make the distinction, sure, please.
Yeah, and it's pretty straightforward, and we laid this out in the body of the amendment I offered back in November. It's also laid out in NSM-20. Even if you look at 620I, it also does not, in our view, prevent the transfer of defensive weapons. So what are we talking about? We're talking about Iron Dome. We're talking about air defense systems. We're not talking about systems that may sometimes have defensive purposes, but are mostly used for offensive purposes, right? So, aircraft that are all being used, these are offensive weapon systems.
The F-35s, you would...
F-35s, F-16s, F-15s. I mean, these are all being used for offensive purposes right now in Gaza. The defensive systems are the systems that were, used primarily to intercept the missiles that were launched by Iran, where we worked with obviously with Israel, but our partners in the region, and used our own assets to intercept those. Those are primarily sort of ground-based air defense systems.
Senator, you said before that you're hoping that we can get into a conversation about the day after, about the future terms for peace here. What occurred on October 7th was, of course, heinous and reprehensible, but we understand that we're not going to solve for the future unless we're able to take up these questions in a fulsome way in the context of the past. For many, 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 many years, you've shown a spotlight on the challenges in the West Bank with illegal settler expansion into the West Bank. I think that there has been a profound lack of accountability, not just in Israel on this issue, but in the context of U.S. foreign policy as well. Regrettably, in the last 8 months, the circumstances in the West Bank have only been exasperated. You hinted a bit at that. I wonder if I can get you to speak more about the challenge in the West Bank at a moment when everyone's gaze is, of course, rightly on Gaza, and how we solve for all of this into the future. There are many thoughtful actors who have been assessing this space for so long, and say things like the path to a two-state solution is getting further and further closed off as a consequence of these encroachments. How do you view all of this? How do we solve for it?
Well, as you say, that has been the challenge for not only years but decades now. And I referenced this proposal on the table right now that the president put forward based on an Israeli proposal. Obviously, step one is to get a ceasefire, get the hostages released, and get those sort of steps moving. But ultimately, we do need to do what the president also laid out pretty early in this conflict when he tried to provide some light at the end of this very dark tunnel by saying that we need to make sure that we have no more October 7th. We need to assure Israel has the security that it needs and deserves. But we also need to make sure that Palestinians, the overwhelming majority of millions of Palestinians who have nothing to do with Hamas, have a future horizon that brings them dignity and self-determination and security. And this is why I've supported, U.S. policy has supported the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel. That has been the policy, the stated policy of the United States since George W. Bush was president. I mean, we had a version of that for a long time, but it was articulated then. So we're talking, close to 20 years ago now. And I also agree with the president that that has to be combined with a normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia and other Arab states in the region who have not yet recognized Israel, which is why back in September, before October 7th and the horrific attacks of October 7th, I, together with Chris Murphy, a group of us, wrote to the president in the context of what were then the negotiations on the Saudi deal. And if you look at the letter we sent, it said very clearly, you're not going to achieve long-term peace and stability in the region without addressing the Palestinian equities. You cannot just keep leaping over that issue and expect long-term stability and peace. And of course, that came true in the most horrific way on October 7th. So what do we do? You just said that if you want to achieve a two-state solution, the first thing you got to do is prevent things from getting worse. And what we've done for 20 years is essentially sit back and watch as more settlements have been built deeper and deeper into the West Bank. We now have the most right-wing extreme Israeli government history. People who used to be considered on the fringes of Israeli politics are not only in the government. I mean, we have the finance minister who has a big portfolio in the West Bank. We have Ben-Gvir, the head of national police. This is the most extreme government.
People who Netanyahu himself rejected as extremists a few years ago.
He did. Look, if you haven't read it, about 2 weeks ago, New York Times Magazine did a very good piece laying out this trajectory that we've seen in politics in Israel that is bringing us to this moment. So there are a lot of people, very smart people, who say that there's no way to achieve a two-state solution at this point. My view is this is the last chance. This is the last gasp, because if we're not successful at stopping and then rolling back these outposts and a lot of the settlements now, then we're not going to be able to achieve this goal. And so the United States does need to use more of its influence as well on the West Bank. I mean, West Bank has been just a horrible situation since the Gaza war began. And I applaud the administration for its executive order that applies sanctions on extremist settlers. They named 4. There are some other entities. But as you said, this is really the enterprise of this government. And Smotrich has a big portfolio overseeing the West Bank. In my view, Smotrich should be subject to sanctions under this EO because he is facilitating a lot of what's happening right now in the West Bank. So
I think you just made a little bit of news here.
Well, it's, if you look at that EO, it essentially says that for individuals who are undermining the stability and on the West Bank, they should be subject to it. He is withholding funds as we speak from the Palestinian Authority. His goal is to destroy the Palestinian Authority. He's also essentially, he's responsible for the biggest one-year sort of land grab since the Oslo Accords. So, you've got this person whose stated goal is for essentially Israel to take over the entire West Bank. I mean, that actually is in the agenda for this new government. And he's doing these things that we object to. We keep talking about it, but we need to actually do more about it. And then, this is where the president's leadership is going to be so important. And I know it's a tough time in Israel. Netanyahu's peddling this idea that a two-state solution rewards Hamas. It's actually the opposite. Hamas has been a one-state group. They want it all, right? Hamas's goal has been to destroy modern-day Israel. That is in their documents. That is their goal. They don't support a two-state solution. And in fact, if you look at the history here, and I've documented it and quoted it, you have Netanyahu essentially keeping Hamas going as a going concern because, and this is in his own words, as long as Hamas was in charge of Gaza, who could accept a two-state solution that included the West Bank and Gaza? And it was a fair question. And so dividing the Hamas and the PA was a priority. And actually, if you look at Smotrich and Netanyahu, they're more worried about the PA because the PA is the entity that wants a two-state solution. Netanyahu does not want a two-state solution. Smotrich does not want a two-state solution. They want it all too. If you look at the agenda for this new Israeli government, they say essentially they want Israeli control, exclusive control over Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. That's in their document. This is the goal of Smotrich. This is the goal of Ben-Gvir. And the United States is going to have to, this is a moment of reckoning, have to be willing to stand up because, and I'll close with this on this point. I asked Secretary Blinken twice in a hearing last week whether a creation of a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, was in our national security interest. Yes. Yes. And it's pretty obvious, right? We've sent aircraft carrier groups. We're in the Gulf of Oman. We just helped intercept a whole array of missiles from Iran. Secretary of State has been 8 times to Israel. Same with the national security, lots of times, right? Austin. We have now devoted so many resources to this when we have all these other big challenges, right? We have Russia, we have China, and yet we've devoted this is a national security priority for us. It can't just be put on the Saudis to say that they want a two-state. It's in our national security interest too. So we need to be pushing much harder to achieve our own national security interests. Otherwise, this is going to, if we don't achieve, self-determination, dignity, and security for everybody, we're going to be at this again.
So, Senator, I need to open up this conversation to journalists we have here and other policy leaders who are present. You just said so much. I want to ask you so many questions about Article 2, the limits of presidential power and where congressional power pokes in on foreign policy. But you mentioned sanctions. And so I hope that you can give me a very succinct response to this next question, and then we'll open it up. International, you talk about international rule of law. We know the circumstances with the International Criminal Court right now. You have colleagues in the U.S. Senate, Republicans and Democrats, who've called for the sanctioning of the ICC if they take these steps against Israel. What's your position? And how do we think about the architecture of international rule of law on this issue as succinctly as possible?
Sure, I'll try and be succinct. Look, I share some of the concerns expressed by the Biden administration, some of them regarding the process here, although I encourage everybody to read, the documents put forward by the prosecutor. He doesn't draw any equivalence between the actions of Hamas and Israel. He talks about the brutality of the murders and the taking of hostages. He does talk about restricting humanitarian assistance. But regardless of what anybody thinks about that decision, it would be counter to our interests to try to punish or sanction officers of the court, right? You can disagree with a decision, but that doesn't mean you go about sanctioning the officers of the court. The person who would really be popping champagne bottles if we do that is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, of course, was at the receiving end of an arrest warrant from this court. The United States at the time embraced that, even though we're not a party of the court. We've actually sent at least $5 million to help gather evidence with respect to Russian war crimes. So the one person who wants to undermine the court more than anybody is Vladimir Putin. So when I read the report about, some of my Republican colleagues, threatening the officers of the court, threatening their families, threatening their employees, I mean, this is more befitting, mafia thugs than U.S. senators, and it is totally counterproductive to our interests.
Thank you, Senator. Questions, please.
Our first question is going to come from Yasmin Taib with sort of a follow-up to your most recent question.
Sure. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Van Hollen, for being here, for everything you're doing. Really appreciate it. You said most of this, but as you know, the House is voting this week, as early as tomorrow, on legislation and to sanction the ICC, and the legislation is expected to pass. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on what you think the prospects of similar legislation passing in the Senate would be, and if there's anything that advocates can do to push back against it. Thank you.
Sure. Well, for all the reasons I just mentioned, that's a really bad idea. I was also pleased to see the administration say that it would be a bad idea to sanction the court. So that is also now the position of the Biden administration. If that bill gets out of the House, and I expect it will, I don't think it will pass the United States Senate. That does not mean there won't be efforts to bring up that or other versions of it, but I don't think that it will pass the United States Senate. Again, there may be votes on different versions of it. Someone might try to bring it up by unanimous consent in the United States Senate, but I think that will be it. Now, I should say, though, there may be other efforts to put that provision on other bills that are going to be traveling through the United States Congress. And so in terms of advocates, that would be the next place to look.
I think we have questions from some reporters.
Yes, we have several hundred people watching us online, so we're going to turn to Allison to share one of those questions with us.
Thanks so much, Senator, and thanks, Patrick. We have a question online from Jim Reeser. Jim's asking about the Biden proposal that's on the table that Biden referenced on Friday, and asking specifically about what it means for the long-term rebuilding of Gaza. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to what plans for reconstruction might look like in Gaza.
Sure, I'll do my best. That proposal, which again, the president said that this is a proposal that the Israeli War Cabinet had approved of, and now you're getting pushback, from some members of the coalition government. But it has three parts, and sort of the last part of it moves into the reconstruction phase. And, in order, in my view, to get sort of beyond the massive infusion of humanitarian assistance that's going to be required, which, is why we need a ceasefire and a return of the hostages, in order to actually begin a serious effort to have reconstruction in Gaza. You've seen the pictures. I mean, it's flattened. It's flattened. So you're going to require an enormous amount of resources, and to succeed in getting the resources that will be required, it is going to have to involve, in my view, a lot of the Arab countries in the region, including Saudi Arabia and others. And in order for them to be willing to make that kind of investment, they're going to have to know sort of the parameters of the future. Number one, obviously, no Israeli reoccupation of Gaza. That would obviously be a non-starter. But they're going to want to transfer governance to Palestinian leadership. The president's talked about a reformed PA, having some leadership there. And all of that may also be premised on these longer term trajectories. Obviously, the Saudis and others have been focused on a two-state solution. So the bottom line is that the reconstruction, serious reconstruction, in my view, will only be successful not only when we get the three parts of this agreement, but when these other pieces begin to fall into place.
Let's do this. I have a question from Matt Duss. Let's get Matt in here. But as we do that, we can then group two questions from journalists online next. That works.
Yeah.
Hi. Thanks to you both for a really great conversation. And Senator, thank you as always for your years of hard work on this and just being a leading voice on these values and these issues. Last week, the Congress sent an invitation to Prime Minister Netanyahu to come and address once again a joint meeting of Congress. And what I'm thinking of is a piece that was published this morning in Haaretz by my friend Amir T-Bone. Some of you may know Amir. He's a journalist. He was in one of the communities that was attacked on October 7th. He spent endless hours, locked inside a safe room with his children, hearing what was going on until he was rescued by his own father, among others. But he wrote a piece today that really articulates something really important, which is that giving Netanyahu this benefit once again, given everything he's done, not only to Gaza, but the fact that Netanyahu has yet to meet or visit those communities that were attacked as prime minister almost 8 months, is essentially a slap in the face to those communities, but also I think left liberal forces in Israel who are the allies of Democrats, of liberals, of progressives. And I think this is just a really stark example of a phenomenon that we've seen for a long time. And it was like yes, we can talk about the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship, but the lack of consequence and the rewarding of leaders like Netanyahu in this way is essentially wind at the back of anti-liberal forces. So if you could just any thoughts on the invitation?
Well, let me start with the bottom line, which is it's very disappointing to see the Speaker of the House initiate that invitation, and it's in my view a mistake that it appears to be going forward for all the reasons you've said and more. And you've got a situation where the Prime Minister of Israel has listened much more to his very right-wing coalition, including people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, than to the views of its partner, the United States, and President Biden. And I do think it sends a a really bad signal, not only to all those constituencies that you just mentioned in Israel, but also, globally, given the current situation. Now, for those of you who don't follow this procedure closely, this was initiated by Speaker Johnson. I mean, he's essentially, to your point, become the campaign manager for Bibi Netanyahu's reelection campaign. I mean, this is, going to help. I mean, I'm told that this will make Bibi Netanyahu the world leader who has, presented to the joint session more than any other. He's going to surpass Churchill's record, right? That's what I'm told. I mean, he is no Winston Churchill, okay? And I think that, unfortunately, what Speaker Johnson is doing is playing Israeli politics and U.S. politics. The invitation to address a joint session should not be about politics, but that's what he has made it. So that's where we are. I do want to really quickly say thank you for mentioning, civil society within Israel. I mean, there are so many amazing Israeli, human rights groups. There's some really important Palestinian human rights groups that have been sort of isolated by some of the actions of this Netanyahu government and others. But I do want to give more voice to all of those who are in Israel, talking about human rights, talking about the need to end the expansion of the settlements, talking about settler violence. There are a whole host of voices that are not really heard here at least by most Americans. So I think thank you for lifting them up in your question. And you're right, all of those people who stand up for human rights, who stand up for shared values, this will be seen by them and others as an insult.
And so we'll take this final question from online, Senator. But as we do so, I'm thinking about everything you just said about the joint session of Congress and that address. And it's striking that during the Kenya state visit that we had a week before last, there was a request made for the president of Kenya to address Congress, and the speaker said that there was no time on Congress's schedule to hear from this African head of state. There has not been an African head of state addressing Congress since Nelson Mandela over 20 years ago. But somehow there's time for yet another address from Benjamin Netanyahu. These things matter as we're viewed around the world and as we attempt to extend real meaningful partnership. Let's take the last online questions, Allison.
I think we're actually going to take the last question from the room, from
Right.
Naji Schumann.
Thanks, Senator, for attending this, and thanks for Cap for putting this on. First things I'll say, I'm a Baltimore resident, and I think I feel like one of the few Americans, definitely one of the few Arab Americans, who can say their senator is actually speaking for them when it comes to this issue. Thank you for that, Senator Van Hollen. You answered this a little bit with the last question, but I think I really wanted to know what your take was on the precedent that we're setting with the defense of some of these Israeli policies we're seeing. You mentioned Vladimir Putin, what's happening in China, obviously with Taiwan and the Philippines. Those leaders are probably watching what we are allowing our own ally to get away with in terms of the attacks on journalists and on hospitals. And I'm wondering how that undermines our credibility on the global stage when we try to advocate against those leaders taking similar actions in their own conflicts.
Well, it's great to have you here from Maryland. And this really goes to the point that I made earlier on, but just to amplify it, which is if the United States is going to maintain a foreign policy based on values like human rights, like freedom of the press, making sure we protect journalists in conflict zones, like democracy, like self-determination. Yes, for Israelis, of course, in the state of Israel, but also for Palestinians in the state of Palestine. If we're going to have a values-based approach, we undermine our own credibility, interest, and soft power, which is a critical part of who we are, when we're seen not to apply these principles uniformly. And again, as I said earlier, it's a messy world. I mean, again, it's going to be never going to be perfect. But what you don't want to do is give your adversaries even more ammunition to say, the United States, they say all these things. They say these beautiful things, but when push comes to shove, they are not applying them to their friends and their partners. And if you have a principles-based foreign policy, it's obviously important that they be applied as close as possible in a principled way. And I want to tell this story because it actually hooks up not with Kenya specifically, but it does connect up with the global South. And I wish the Kenyan leader had been able to, make a joint statement before Congress. So long before October 7th and the horrors of October 7th, I took a couple of trips overseas with some of my colleagues. And in one meeting, we met with the South African foreign minister, and I was just saying, Patrick, I got to get a readout from him on, the most recent elections in South Africa and everything happening. In another meeting, we met with the Indonesian foreign minister. And again, this is early in last year, long before October 7th. And, we met with our embassy folks, and part of our purpose in these conversations was to encourage these countries to support us at the United Nations on resolutions condemning Vladimir Putin and Russia's occupation of Eastern Ukraine and what was happening including, in the past in Crimea. And so we did. The first of these two trips was with the South African foreign minister. We were meeting in meeting. I can't remember if it was Johannesburg or where, but anyway.
Minister Pandor.
Yes. And so we, each of us went around talking about how it would be really important for South Africa to, stick with principles of, non-aggression and oppose the Russian occupation in Eastern Ukraine. South African foreign minister, well, for 20 years, you have supported the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. What are you doing here lecturing to us about occupation? Same conversation plays out with the Indonesian foreign minister way before October 7th. We want you to sort of, take a position with us, vote with us at the UN on condemning Russian occupation of Eastern Ukraine and aggression. What about you guys on the West Bank? And so it goes to this point about, long before October 7th and trying to make sure that, our weapons in Gaza are used in a manner consistent with international law and that we have delivery of humanitarian assistance. When it goes to the broader conflict, people around the world, especially in the global South, where we're competing for influence with China and others, are calling us out on what they see as this hypocrisy. And that has a more harmful impact than I think a lot of people recognize. So look, I understand that we've got a long way to go to try and create some light at the end of this tunnel. I don't know if it'll happen. But for the good of Israel and the people of Israel and Israel's own long-term security, for the good of the Palestinian people, for the good of people in the region, and for the good of the United States, we need to finally begin actually putting some diplomatic muscle and real influence behind what the Secretary of State described as our national security interest, which is achieving Palestinian state for some self-determination dignity, provide security to Israel with a normalization agreement, the Saudis and others in the region. Because if we don't do that, we're going to continue to unfortunately be, you don't address the security issue, it will keep coming back. And we also need to address it because of our broader international goals so that we do better align our foreign policy with our principles and our values.
Senator, thank you for how generous you were with your time. Thank you for the generosity of your thoughts. Thank you for your moral clarity and your principled patriotism. We can't express enough appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you.